which architecture's, I mean, I sort of moan a lot, and I like critiquing architecture because it's the thing I love best, and I love the profession, and I love architects.
There's a lot to criticize, I think.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's, I criticize it because I love it so much, and I'm very, the things, like when I criticize people and tendencies, it's like at the same time I'm criticizing myself, because I know that those tendencies are normally part of how I operate, because I'm part of it. But I'm also criticizing through love, and there's a sort of tenderness in those critiques.
I like, I'm on the end of a lot of criticism because I'm still in architecture school.
Yeah, I mean, I bet you get all the crap in your crits now.
Oh man, today I had a crit today, like I said, and I got roasted, but I was given a lot of credit for having all the drawings and for having a lot of passion and whatnot. But yeah, I won't say anything more because we're on.
And your tutor will listen.
Maybe. No, I mean, like what I was going to say is you are a tutor at Central St. Martin's.
At CSM.
Yeah, at Central St. Martin's. And I like what you just said, that, you think of it as it's in a loving way. You're giving someone criticism. Yeah. I like to think of it that way. But as a student, it doesn't come across that way with a lot of tutors. I mean, I can pick it up. I mean, for example, I'm not going to give examples because... yeah,
no specifics.
No specifics, but I can sense when somebody really does care about my project, and somebody else, and this is going to bring us on to an interesting subject we just talked about, and somebody else is just concerned about the result being a certain result or a certain image or a certain style. Yeah. And this is now the whole... There's
a lot of that.
Yeah, the whole Bartlett culture is very much everybody has to produce this fantastical, fictional narrative. And
but similarly, there's the old London Met culture of everything has to be these like super phenomenological, delicate, charcoal drawing-y, black and white brick interiors. So, I mean, it just, depending where you are, the expectation is different, but sometimes the pressure is the same, pushing you towards something which is relatively subjective, but they present it as objective criticism. But it's actually just geared towards pushing you towards a particular result that they want.
Yeah, but
it's not always like that. There's certain types of critique.
Do you think that's, as a tutor, do you think that's okay? You think that's all right to do?
Yeah, I mean, in a way that I just think that students shouldn't be handled with like kiddie gloves, because we should learn in university to be able to understand when criticism should be taken and when it shouldn't, and judge for ourselves what we allow through
as students.
Yeah, as students already, because in the real world you're going to have to be doing that constantly. Yeah. Okay, people give you what's often or normally phrased as beneficial feedback. They give it for a lot of ulterior motives. There are a lot of bad reasons or selfish reasons.
Yes.
But that's how you that's how you manipulate people in projects.
Yeah, but most students won't have anything to say to that.
Well, you have it's a very, very good skill to learn. Yeah. Or understand when the motivations are behind certain critiques given towards you are ones which means that perhaps you'd better smile, agree, and then not take that on board. So it's differentiating between different types of criticism. It's a really, really good skill to have. No, I don't think it's great that they do that, but I also think that you can't stop people teaching in particular ways, because their feedback might be geared towards pushing you towards a certain type of drawing, but I'm sure they're also really good as tutors in other respects. Yeah. And even when so in the AA, I really enjoyed the AA, and I went through the unit system trying to make the most of it. Every year I would choose a unit which was as different as possible to any of the previous units that I chose. So I had a wildly bizarre like roller coaster ride through the school. And a lot of those studios, there was a lot of pressure to design in the way that the tutor designed. And I didn't take that as a bad thing. I just took it as a learning experience and took what I could from it, and also reacted against it, because I think in a way it's also beneficial that a teacher gives you a very clear position that you can then be like, screw you, I disagree with you, and hate them for it, because at least it helps you as a young person understand what you don't like. And it also teaches you sometimes that you have to learn skills and do things for a period of time that you don't love. That's a good thing to learn.
Put that on a t-shirt, someone.
And I was just thinking of a nice quote in terms of criticism given with not always positive intent. There's a Paul Simon song, and a part of the song, or sort of a quote from the song, is "There's no tenderness in your honesty." which is, it's about a loving relationship. But sometimes with tutors it's the same. It's like sometimes you're like, okay, you're being really honest and it's great, but there's no tenderness there, so perhaps tone it down. But anyway, CSM has a, just to sort of, I don't know, like advertise the school, it has a very sort of caring culture relative to other schools. So we don't have so much of that aggressive crit culture at all.
Oh really? I would have thought that's just part of architecture itself. I've only arrived at CSM 3 years ago, so the culture was already in place. It's a very collegiate atmosphere compared to the other schools that I've experienced. Collegiate, sorry, what does that mean?
It's friendly, communal, working together,
sort of like colleague,
not so competitive.
Colleague.
Yeah, collegiate, like colleagues, friends.
Got it. I'm trying to learn new words too. So.
It's literally like a college, collegiate.
Got it. We've kind of gone straight into it.
Really?
Yeah. There was a lot more before I wanted to say, but I'm going to say it now.
Well, you can go backwards and forwards because you can cut, can't you?
Yeah, I know. Just keep it how it is.
Okay.
Because what I like personally is you got a podcast in your ears when you're doing relatively passive work in architecture.
Yeah,
something
like
doesn't involve.
background.
And like if it's natural, it's natural. I wanted to ask you this. It's quite a.
Is it heavy?
It's heavy.
Oh God. Okay, I need a tea. I'm gonna drink some more tea.
What strikes me even more than your whole, you're a bit of a virtuoso, I would say. What strikes me more than your sort of your background and what you've done is your actual background. Your Japanese, Argentinian, and Israeli heritage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's slightly simplified.
Yeah. That.
Yeah, but it's London. Come on, you've also got an interesting background. It's London.
Yeah, but
there's a lot of us.
Japanese, Argentinian, and Israeli. I would never put those three together. Where's that all from?
The explanation is not that complicated. It's like it's a bit of World War II, bit of pogroms.
Next time someone asks where you're from, just a bit of World War II.
People got chucked around, didn't they?
That's a hard question to answer nowadays. Where are you from?
Where are you from? Yeah, we all need those BBC programs. That BBC program.
Which one?
Who Are You? Who Are You? There's this BBC program where they take a celebrity and I love this program so much, and they research their history, and they even take people who seem like just a really normal English bloke or a really normal West Indian heritage bloke, and then they really do like proper amazing research. Like they go to.
Is that the DNA thing, or is this something separate?
No. It's like historical archival research, and they always find out the most incredible stories. Always, even from people who seem superficially very boring. So anyway, that's a program that I always liked growing up. But
What's it called?
Huh?
What's it called?
Who Do You Think You Are?
Who do you think
you are? It's really nice because it's just lovely. It's like TV where it's a bit like I like Gogglebox because it warms your heart, and this is a program that warms your heart. Somebody on a personal journey, and it makes you like them. When a lot of stuff in the media generally nowadays is about hating people.
Yeah, it's weird though, isn't it? Like,
people.
Yeah, it's weird though, isn't it? Like, we're like, for the first time in history, I guess, we see humans watching other humans watch humans for entertainment.
Oh, you what, like Gogglebox?
Gogglebox. There's the whole thing about like kids who like watch other kids playing games on YouTube.
Okay.
These are really
sorry.
Reaction videos. What
are
they about?
What is that?
On YouTube, it's a huge thing.
I don't know what that is. What is a
reaction? They watch
video?
Someone who I guess they look up to in some ways, or someone special react to another YouTube video.
Okay. Well, I mean, growing up, I was really bad at computer games, and I didn't have computer games actually. But my brother did, and I used to spend hours, days watching him play.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I never played, and I actually still to this day, if it's like a computer game or something, I prefer to watch people play.
Yeah. Maybe it's not a new thing. Maybe it's just translation.
I think there's a very, like, normally with all these new medias, we can say, oh, it's so terrible, and have a moral panic about it. But they're normally popular because they tie into some sort of human need that we've always found different outcomes or outlets for. But sorry, in terms of background, do you still want to?
Yeah.
No, it's simple. The story is pretty simple. It's So on my mother's side, my grandfather on my mother's side was a Jewish refugee from Munich, which wasn't a great thing in the 1930s. So he was a refugee from Munich, and he he managed to get to the only city that was accepting Jews in the world. I might be a bit wrong about some of this because I actually haven't researched it. This is just sort of from what I know from family that I've heard over the years, which was Shanghai. Shanghai was apparently the only city that was accepting Jews still at that particular time. I don't know the dates. And he managed to make it from there to Kobe in Japan. I think that the sort of ideal route for at the time was to get from there to Kobe, and then from Kobe to get a fake visa to get to Honolulu, which would then get you to America.
Yeah,
it was America, so it was like a way to get. This is before, and this is before Japan.
All right.
Joined. I think it was before. Yeah, it was before the war. And he made it to Kobe, and he then in Japan met my great grandfather, who was like kind of progressive. He was a court painter for the imperial family in Japan, in Tokyo.
Wow. Court painter, as in he painted the buildings.
No, as in he was like one of the official painters, and like he would paint the family, like he would paint portraits, and he would paint portraits of business people and stuff. So he was sort of a painter for the elite, I guess. It's like there,
the photographers of the time, essentially.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Well, no, because they would have had photographers, but yeah, it's along those lines. And he was a bit of a liberal, and I think he was sort of like helping the Jews in some way. And my grandfather got his daughter pregnant. That was sort of something along those lines.
Fair play.
And I don't quite know what happened there, but they met and ended up
impregnated.
Yes. Sorry, whenever I talk about this, it's like really bad because it shows how little I've researched my family history.
I don't think many people would know much about their own family backgrounds, to be honest. That's more than I know.
I think it happens when we get older. No, it's like I think probably as I get older I'll start to like want to research it more. At the moment it's still sort of broad brushstrokes. And then during the war he got hidden in a mountain village because as a foreigner, the foreign police would sort of wanted to intern you in Japan, but this village communally sort of hid him.
Wow.
So that's how the Japanese side happened. And I say Israeli just because because then they moved eventually to Israel in the 1960s. So it's not like there's sort of my grandfather wasn't Israeli, but we just say that. It's just say that because it's easier. Than that confusing story. And then the other side is just Argentina. My father's families migrated to Argentina in the 19th century from Moldova, where there were pogroms happening. So sort of a lot of murders and stuff. So they moved to a place called Entre Rios in Argentina, which was populated by a lot of Jews. So it's sort of Jewish farming area in the Pampas. And then my father met my mother in Israel.
Wow.
So that's how it happened.
Were you born there?
No, I was born here. So there's a lot of similar stories amongst Jewish Israelis.
Wow.
It's just really sort of quite international.
I'd love to see a
stories.
Map sort of track for that. That'd be pretty interesting. We're doing a lot of mapping in our studio, so. Still on my
yes,
edge.
I mean, from the subject that you mentioned, I imagine that's probably one of the few ways you can get to grips with the subject.
Yeah. When you say get to grips, it's such a contestation. Yeah, I mean, I was just saying to you earlier.
It sounds like a course at SOAS.
Yeah, it is very political. Very, very political. I guess that's why you've got to have tutors who know what they're talking about in that sense.
Yeah.
One of the tutors is Palestinian, so that makes it a little bit harder proposing solutions because it's more personal to the tutor than let's say if you were doing a generic project for.
But it's also nice probably that you get
it's
that
an experience that
I
probably won't have. That's why I chose a studio.
Yeah.
And like I said before, we went there. I mean, I've vlogged every day that I was there, so that's gonna come out soon, hopefully.
And you documented and you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not like Louis Theroux standard, but it's like,
why not?
I haven't got anyone who would help me with that.
Okay.
But yeah, if anyone's offering,
you've got to learn how to co-opt your fellow students.
I wish
they're a really good labour pool.
How? I'm not that manipulative, but I wish I was.
Find a way.
Yeah.
Or start a collective or something.
Madam or sir. Or something. I was gonna say, you talked about your architectural background, but we generally talked about this, so we just covered it quite briefly before that. Do you need to go through a formal architecture education to end up practicing architecture? And I guess that question carries another sort of underlying question that, I mean, this is going to sound really cliche or really a bit snobby, but what is architecture essentially? What is it today in its, in the way it's formally practiced, where it's going, what other fields it starts to cross over with? If somebody says I'm an architect, it's not what it means today. It's not the same as what it means today as what it meant 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you necessarily?
Yeah, but I mean, in
that?
terms of its legal definition, it's pretty much the same. That hasn't changed.
Sure.
By the the ARB, you're as a registered architect.
Yeah.
It is quite clearly defined.
Yeah. I mean, you're an architect, meaning you deal with architecture and buildings and construction. Yeah. And that's why that's where you get your standards and your regulations, and that's again why it is protected, because you have to follow the certain standards to be able to.
Yeah. Although weirdly, only the name's protected, which is very odd. Not the practice.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. So that's kind of a leeway into it, that people can practice.
That literally means that in this country anyone can do buildings, which is
just this country.
Well, I don't know about other countries.
About America?
No, it's super protected in America.
Is it?
Yeah. It's even difficult, I think, to move from state to state. You have to re-register from state to state. Right. They have different chapters of the AIA. Yeah, I only know about like Spain, Germany, Italy, Australia. They're all very protected.
Let's say there's someone out there right now, though.
More than us.
Yeah, let's say there's someone out there right now who is. I know someone right now. I actually saw him in the train this morning. He did a work experience with us. Mm-hmm. Young fella, really bright. He's getting like offers from every uni. Could he have potentially not gone down this route of £27,000 in debt and how many hours and hours and hours and hours and hours spent on doodling and drawing and doing fictional, fantastical, phenomenological projects? Do you have to do all that to have a career in architecture?
No. I guess it's a simple answer.
You have it.
But it depends on the kind of career you want. So you can go in and you can train on the job, and you can work directly for a contractor. You can work in practices and work your way up. The thing is, what you won't get is you won't get the relatively fast, I guess you can say, indoctrination. You won't be fed and be placed within the continuum of architecture as a cultural discourse. So there is architecture as a technical drawing exercise, as a contractual management side. It's a project management aspect, although that's very much lost by most architects. But there's a sort of more practical side of the profession. But what you do get when you're studying is you get embedded in this idea of architecture as an artistic cultural pursuit that does have a very long history, that is international, that goes right back to the Renaissance, that is has a sort of philosophical, theoretical context that is not just purely functional. And it's to become cultured in something. What I mean by that is not like to be wonderful, but to be cultured is to be trained in. So if I'm brought up in the North London Jewish community, it takes many years of growing up in that to understand all of their weird habits and what specific phrases actually mean, and it's being cultured in something. And similarly, going through architectural university, you get cultured in the broader idea of. So you think most
of that culture is in uni as opposed to work?
No, and again, I don't want to. I don't want to sort of give a broad brush answer and say no, they're totally separate. But it is easier, and that is a function of architectural education in university, and it's people complain that it's not practical enough, but you really do. Or that there is an attempt to sort of imbue you with a love of that side of architecture, which is relatively important, because otherwise architecture can just be about churning out stuff that you don't really care for that much.
See, this is the thing. I think this is what drew me towards architecture, and it's that it's the sciences, if you like, meeting the arts. And that's again where you have the objectivity and the subjectivity. And that's again why I think we have so much to talk about and so many criticisms, if you like, and so many, you know, opinions about it, because this objective and subjective clash is always happening. You know, is there a science to design, or is that design strictly, you know, contextually and relative?
And all that debate is so, you know, we're such a wonderful profession because we can't stop talking endlessly. And, you know, even if it's the same points, we still argue about them. And that's a really nice thing. And, you know, I have friends who've gone down other career routes, and, you know, they don't get intellectually stimulated by their working environment. They get paid a lot more than we do, but they don't get stimulated in the way that we do. And I think that's really valuable. And then universities and education provides, first of all, a training in that environment. But secondly, it also provides a forum for that discussion to survive and continue. So there's like lots of crazy drawings that don't make sense. But there's also, in the best instances, conversation, dialogue, and discussion, and a space where architects on the opposite end of the spectrum to those who are very practical are financially supported. If you think about it this way, they're financially supported by the state and by students to actually effectively, as well as teaching, keep that side of the profession alive by constantly talking about nothing and arguing about nothing, but that nothing is actually the core of why we're not just builders.
What we're doing now.
Exactly. And they sort of foster that. Ideally, they foster that within the university environment, and they foster that with all the journals that they put out, and they foster that with pushing students to do zines and exhibitions and conferences. And of course, you know, that happens in architecture. That happens in some practices. There's a lot of practicing architects who operate in that way, but without the sort of communal platforms that universities provide with financial muscle, it would be much more diffuse, and it'd be more like just, you know, architect friends at a pub, or maybe occasional exhibition at the design museum.
What would you say is the purpose of architecture fundamentally? Is it to create sort of social change? Is it to, like you say, start the conversations? But then you would argue the conversations are the preliminary process to create some sort of change, social or economic or communal mainly. Or is architecture purpose to just create space that responds to a particular need?
Well, you know, there's that traditional difference between architecture and building. You know, so buildings can just respond to a need.
Sure.
And they don't have to look a particular way. And, you know, architecture comes in the moment something becomes more than functional. Even if the function is distorted and becomes something more than just a basic brief. Just that architecture stops being building and becomes architecture the moment something moves beyond being purely functional. And that includes when function becomes the object of design itself. So, you know, you have the super Dutch architects or REM, and they mess with the brief itself, and they make function almost bizarrely illogical. So they're distorting function itself, but that is architecture because it's beyond basic function. We are, in a way, ornament to society. We are superfluous excess, beauty within the sphere of building. What I mean by that is there is no one purpose to architecture, because we're not needed. Architects could all disappear tomorrow, and there'd be no fundamental material quantitative problem. Okay, 50 years down the line, we would live in horrible environments that gave us no intellectual nourishment. There was no beauty, there was no sensitivity, no thought. There would be a lot of conversation and discussion about place and space that would be lost. But quantitatively, in terms of like our needs for living in space, for being housed, being enclosed, those could be covered without us entirely.
So is the point of our work
the qualitative side of things?
Beauty, essentially.
So we're not ants.
Yeah.
So we make space, and we make buildings, and we make ornament, and we make objects which are beyond pure function, because that makes us human. And those are the reflections of all of the discussions, all of the superfluous discourse, all of the theory, all of the philosophies, all of the ideas that we have in a given moment reflected visually through architecture and through spaces. An example that I kind of bring up is that anthropologically, the first things that human societies have always done when they've coalesced into groups and formed societies has been, on the one hand, there is they leave some sort of traces on the spaces around them, cave paintings, and the other is that they create jewelry and ornament themselves. And it's like bizarre. Why would you make jewelry, right? Objectively,
make a hut.
It's not functional.
Yeah,
they don't have a purpose.
Some sort of shelter or something.
But it's together with shelter. So together with functional tools, fire, hunting. But there's always at the same time there is symbolic and representational elements.
Right.
Okay. Jewelry, paintings, and also ornaments. So, like for instance, the ornamental weaving of fabrics in enclosures. Okay. Why do we do this? It's because as humans, part of our instinct is to externalize our mythologies, our social relationships, our hierarchies, and our values in visual symbols. It's what we always do. It's like if you get put in a white room and you have to live there for 2 years, what would you be doing over those 2 years? You'd additively be putting things on the wall, modifying, changing, moving things around. It's because we create worlds which reflect ourselves. Okay, we do the same with nature. We modify nature. What did Robinson Crusoe do on his island? He modified everything to fit his internalized state. That's what we do as humans. And architecture does that. Well, within that, of course, there is a lot of specific problem solving, and architecture can be instrumental in making space work much harder towards social justice, equality. Yes, but overall, those things are not necessary. Fundamentally, overall, I think that's my position in terms of why architecture is there. Because the more you think about why architecture, it is weird because we do seem really superfluous.
Yeah.
As a profession, and it's quite important believing that what you do is important, because nowadays, especially in these very, very large design teams, in projects where architects have very, very relatively peripheral and sort of hierarchically quite low roles, you have to be able to stand up for what can seem intuitive or arbitrary design decisions. You have to be able to stand up for them, and it's good to have a really strong belief at the fundamental ground of your profession being meaningful. And I say this profession, I'm not an architect, so I talk as an architect, but I'm not.
No, I think you have every right to, especially if you're teaching the bloody thing. No, man, that's just opening my eyes to new ways of understanding the very thing I do every single day. Wouldn't there be an argument to that, though? The fact that you're saying that this ornamental expression is an innate kind of quality or need, right?
Instinct. I mean, we just
instinct.
Do it. Yeah.
And there are examples of that, obviously. What someone else might say is that when it comes to the ornamentalization of things, for example, before the painting was on the wall and before the jewelry was made, the shelter was made, the fire was made. Those are the way in which those came about was we need it for a particular function. So could it not be argued that architecture was actually what happened before that jewelry and happened before that painting? It was actually the function of our needs is at the basis of the fundamental, if you like, of what architecture serves.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was proposing was a bit of a paradox, because I think you can't get rid of architects.
Yes. Because
the two go intrinsically together. Because I think what we do as humans is that the moment we do start producing something which is functional, it is always inherently got an ornamental aspect to it,
right?
Because that's what we do.
Right.
There's always meaning to everything that we do. So, even in the most sort of, So the two do go together. I mean, the very first woven fabrics, almost immediately there's experimentation going on with how can I mess with the weave, how can I add different colors to the weave, because it's what we do.
I'm with you. Yeah,
they do go together. So my sort of I guess saying we can get rid of architects and only do purely functional buildings it's a logical fallacy, because I think it's genuinely impossible. It couldn't happen because it goes against our nature and our instincts.
Yeah. And then it makes me think that generally, if you think of a folly, of what, we did a whole project about what a folly is and designing a folly, it's essentially meant to have no function. Yet that was one of the hardest things to do, because if you're just creating an ornament, and this is why I think what you're saying is very true, that they go hand in hand. And I think it's impossible for us to create, unless, I can't think of an example top of my head right now, but to create something that is strictly ornamental, because you could argue that the function of it is to make you feel good or the function of it is to make you to release some sort of dopamine because you've expressed yourself through a painting on the wall, then I guess it comes down to questioning what is your definition of function.
But I mean, like you say, follies are not things without functions. I mean, they were created as visual markers in the landscape that looked pretty in particular ways. So they were created.
That is a function.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's really interesting.
And the two go together.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I've seen you talk a lot about this whole, like how people kind of take a lot of shots at the millennials, if you like.
Yeah.
Architecture school is quite a free place to express whatever ideas you think you can justify. If there was an arena for you to express your ideas, it would be university. Do you think?
Well, I mean, ideally, but I must say I'm sort of perpetually surprised by the lack of diversity of expression shown by architecture students. There does tend to be especially compared to like fine art, there does seem to be a relative conservatism amongst architecture students, and I'm not sure if it's just because there's so much to learn, just skills wise, that actually there's less room for experimentation. Or it could be something that my brother pointed out. No, not my brother, my friend pointed out, which is, he'd be like horrified. He says, like, you guys, you worship your tutors. You all seem like so conservative. And I didn't agree with him at the time, but looking now from sort of, I guess, from an older person's perspective, it does seem to be a relatively conformist student body.
Yeah, I mean, I was
considering the fact that they should be able to be quite free.
Yeah, but this is what I was coming on to, that it is, if universities are meant to be these places of freedom of expression,
and they are. I mean, in terms of the rules,
but in architecture,
yeah,
as you've just outlined, there is this jump on the bandwagon kind of approach.
Yeah, it's not just amongst architecture students. I mean, there is a mentality within architecture in general which does lean towards consistency, communality, shared language. And the moment that there's seen as being too many approaches to architecture at any given time, architects tend to throw their hands up in panic and go, oh no, there's no common language, nothing means anything, it's all just random and arbitrary. It's like they really want to be whipped.
But that's why I find it so surprising.
Line.
I find it so surprising because it is such a politically charged subject. There are so many political objectives and motivations in most architecture projects, especially at university level. Everything seems to be socio-political.
Well, no, it depends where you are.
Maybe
it depends
I've just
on the
been
university.
Exposed to
obviously, you've chosen to be in that kind of context.
Yeah, I mean,
there is a lot of it.
Yeah, but if you were to structure the perfect architecture school, design school,
damn, that's a huge question.
It's a huge one, but would it be much different?
I don't know. I mean, that's such a huge question. Like, I have so much admiration for people who do take on that challenge of like how to structure pedagogy. I have a friend who, she's done a great job of running first year at the AA for the past sort of 6 years, and she's totally restructured, and it's really interesting. She sort of experiments with it, with the structure of it. Cool. I've seen Alex at CSM sort of growing the BA course and herding us tutors. And it's really an art form. Understanding the consequences of organizational change, like what it's just, there's cascades of effects that I could barely understand. So I guess
even though you're sort of,
even though I'm a tutor.
Yeah,
because it's a whole. So what I'm really appreciative of CSM taking me on a few years ago as a tutor, because it's a whole other area. It's a whole other professional area of knowledge that one has to take very, very seriously. It's not like a side job or something to just do willy-nilly, or at least I don't treat it like that, and I think most, definitely in the CSM, none of the other tutors do. It's like a whole other parallel world of architecture, just like running your own practice is complicated, and learning how to deal with clients and learning how to deal with contractors and seeing screw-ups can happen, various areas of liability and just client relationships, just all that kind of stuff they have to learn. There's all the equivalents with briefs, organizational structures, relationships between tutors, technical studies, theory, how that relates to the timetables in the spaces of that university, and how the spaces affect and the timetables affect the students and their relationships with each other, and the relationships between the students in the different studios, and any change, just cascades of effects happen. And it's really, I've been treating it as a really serious learning professional area, or area to learn about year by year. And like, it's funny that you asked that question, because I would love, and I've been thinking about this, I would love one day to build up my experience and my knowledge in this part of the profession to the point where I am able to think at that level of restructuring pedagogy for like a school or a whole course. I would love to.
For what reason?
Because it's fascinating. And I've been really, really interested to see and watch Alex modifying the course, and to see us tutors trying different briefs, and to see CSM negotiating the space and how it affects the students, and the positive effects on the students. It's really nice, they complain and they're really upset and they hate it, and during the year, and then afterwards they're all like, we loved it, so
it was all
you see it was very meaningful to them. And it's very fulfilling. As a teacher, it's very fulfilling to see that you're creating an environment that's meaningful for people, and these people go away. And I've only been teaching a full studio for 3 years, but I was teaching various courses in different universities since I left university 10 years ago. And I've got students in the past who are now, they're like hugely successful people. Way more than me, like hugely important people. Wow. And it's really lovely to see that you were able to be part of that journey.
Oh yeah. So do you plan to stay in pedagogy?
It's really exhausting and it doesn't pay anything, but there's a reason that most tutors do it, is because it gives you a lot.
Yeah.
It's super meaningful.
Yeah.
I remember I went to a lecture in Columbia University, not the country, about Khutemas, which was the architecture school in Moscow, which didn't exist for very long, but had an extremely radical pedagogy, which the constructivists were involved in sort of constructing, in putting together. And the presentation was just wild. Like, they literally just plucked out of thin, like they destroyed the academy, and then they just created out of thin air this whole new structure for a university and a school for teaching architecture.
Scandinavian like, or the opposite?
Formal, highly formal. So like, the students would sort of, at the beginning of the course, they would start just making plaster sculptures with like crazy shapes, and then they would turn those crazy shapes into giant buildings, revolutionary buildings. Really, really strange and interesting pedagogy that only lasted a couple of years and had really interesting, intriguing outcomes in the architectural profession there. But then the Bauhaus was the same. This group of artists and architects came together and created a whole approach to design and architecture and art through their pedagogy. So I guess I get excited because when I think that one day, when I've got enough experience that I sort of understand the mechanics and the logistics of all of the relationships and institutional structures in relation to briefs and personalities and places of a architectural university, that maybe then to think on that scale of like a new university or a new course, like the way that Khutemas was invented, or the Bauhaus pedagogy was invented, would be really thrilling, because it's a design project. Then it becomes a design project. First it has to be mastered.
Yeah.
And it might be that like next year all my students fell and all complain about me and I'll just be kicked out.
And that's a pressure.
And that'll be the end of it.
your students sort of your students, how well your students are doing is a pressure on you, of course, right?
What do you mean?
As in, you are required to have a certain level, your students have to achieve a certain level of competence in that grade. Is there any standards on you that if there's a certain amount of people who get below a certain grade, that's reflecting on you and you're in trouble, or there has to be some sort of review of the way you teach?
I mean, there's no like simple targets, which is great.
Okay.
It's more sophisticated than that. There's just I don't know if it's the same because I've only taught there in terms of full-time course, but there's many layers of what do you call it, moderation, where they check things. So there's quite a lot of layers to make sure that a tutor is operating effectively and students are being supported. There's a lot of extra support for individual students. There's support for tutors as well, if we're struggling, in particular ways. So there's multiple layers of checks, support and moderation, which is much better than a simple target, because simple targets people get, you might have a tutor who ends up for several years in a row with very difficult students with complex background problems, but those tutors are amazing at getting those students to get a D, which is a low pass. But on paper, if there's just a flat target, they come across as being awful and they should be kicked out. But actually, with layers of moderation, it becomes clear and it's conveyed that actually, they're actually doing really well.
This question comes up quite a lot that I've heard in sort of my peers. How easy is it what is the route, shall I say, for a student in architecture to become a teacher? How easy is it? How do you do it? What do they look for? Do they look for you to be an architect? Obviously not in your case.
It depends though, because each course is different.
Right.
So it depends, because one great thing is that we have so many architecture universities here, unlike Italy where they have sort of 300 people to a class. They have
it's an appealing route for an architecture student who, there's often conversations I'm hearing about that it's not very rewarding. We're going off and working in a firm. Maybe we go into teaching. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, teaching is very rewarding. I don't know. I mean, I guess it was the same as most things in my experience, which were like when I needed to get a job, I sent out 75 applications, and I got one job in the end.
That's the secret, huh?
Yeah, and then when I wanted to write, I sent emails to every single editor of every single architecture magazine.
Kidding?
No, and one of them got back to me. Two. One of them got two. One got back to me.
Well, that's the beauty of it. It is that easy. So just
it's not easy. It's like
you got to find them first.
Yeah, and then they might not go back to you. And
well, then in my case, it's easy because I just ask you and just send me the list.
This was a long time ago, but it was. So I just tried, and I've tried other things that didn't work. So it doesn't always work. But like the writing, one editor got back to me and told me to write 3 test articles, and then if he liked one of them, he might think about commissioning some writing.
You had a background body of work, I assume, obviously. Too.
I'd sort of throughout university I always blogged.
Okay.
So I had blogs that I could send. But
so it's always useful for a student who's looking to, let's say, diverge off the path of generic architecture practice. To be somewhat entrepreneurial in there.
You have to be.
You have to in your student
you have to be. And you have. So if you're really interested in writing, you can't just intellectually think, oh, I would like to be a writer.
Yeah,
like
you
I'm interested in writing.
And you're like, yeah, I want to be an architecture writer.
Yeah, you need to be. You should have started design in your university. You should have started the journal. You should have edited something. You should have written cutting investigative articles. Offered yourself to BD, found ways to incorporate writing into your work, into your university project. So effectively finding a way of having some kind of portfolio of work of your interest that then you can take forward to any potential jobs. But in any case, doing those things will normally put you in contact with interesting people anyway.
Yeah.
So, and similarly, like I didn't know that I didn't want to be a designer at university or after university. But what happened is when I was working in offices for many years, I just ended up, I had a passion for design, and design became relatively accessible because of digital software with 3D printing forums. And I just started to do my own stuff on the side. So I was working during the day and I was doing my own projects in the evenings for many years. And it just ended up building up a body of work that then when just, it wasn't a plan, but when it came to me coming to the interview for the designer in residence at the Design Museum, which I got in 2013, I just had this sort of quite big body of work.
It's interesting.
Which has happened because I was doing those things.
Yeah,
the
passion for it will eventually manifest in something better.
Yeah, I mean, you will, whatever, if you've done something, you will always find a use for it. You will always be able to instrumentalize it. You can't instrumentalize nothing. So like you here today doing this is precisely that. It's precisely an example of someone who's got a passion, is trying to approach it in a very serious, considered, methodical and professional way, and it gives you something to work with.
Cause and effect.
Yeah
I love it.
And hopefully you'll meet people through this and it will lead to something else.
Yeah man, that's you have some wise words. I want to get onto something which is heavy, because I was joking about the heavy thing before. That was me asking about your Japanese and Armenian heritage. This is heavy, and it's you gave a talk at the Surface Design Show probably quite a long time ago.
Oh god, that was a really long time ago.
Yeah, I've been digging.
Yeah.
But I watched that and
I had the flu. My god, I had like 42-degree fever when I gave that talk. I was literally zoned out, and I'd been stuck on a bus for an hour or something because there was a tube strike. And it was one of those buses where they didn't let you out between bus stops, and everyone was like panicking. And we were just sitting there for an hour on Charing Cross Road. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit of background.
That's good. I'm going to watch that again and just try and
imagine the
clock
pain.
Your sniffles. No, you gave that talk, and it was about sort of essentially identity, and again the ornamentation thing came into play. I found one thing you said really profound. I don't know whether it was a quote, I don't know whether it was you, but I've written it down. So you said, identity changes day to day, month to month, crisis to crisis, and so it is a relief for many to have meta cultures to fall back on. For example, nationalities, religions, and certainties. For others, it is the religion of background, a pride in unusual origins that seems to invest people with values simply by where their parents were born, or how much their lineages may have been persecuted, and how many stamps they've claimed on their passport of their childhood, from their childhood. I first of all, did you is that something you said, or did you get that from somewhere?
No, I think that talk was all mine. I don't think I quoted from that, but yeah, that's from a film that I made as an intro to the Identity Parade project.
I love that. I really love that. And if you're listening to this, rewind it a bit if it wasn't clear enough for me, and listen to it again, because I'll say obviously identity is a confusing and complicated subject. Yeah. And we could do, I don't even, it's deep talking about identity, especially today. But as you outlined in that passage, it's complicated. And personally, I feel it's also due to the fact that it requires one to be somewhat capable of deep self-reflection and also an element of storytelling in order to figure out your identity.
Well, we have to construct our own stories or understand what our stories are.
There you go. That's why
unless we just accept given ones, which most people do.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's difficult, because you have to do some sort of self-reflection. And I think if you're not actively searching for your identity or confidently trying to construct a positive identity, you're lost in doing it in some sort of passive or subliminal way. Might be an unhealthy activity that gives you, I'll give you an example of someone who's quite somebody who hasn't really sat and deeply reflected, who am I, what do I stand for, what is my purpose, what is my motivation in life. They might just be lost in the humdrum of like going out and, my identity is just having fun, and my identity is just, getting pissed every weekend. That
I'm
makes
the
me happy.
ladette.
Yeah.
Or I'm the party guy.
Yeah, that's why I think it's a difficult conversation for people to have.
But then those precise people tend to then latch onto pre-constructed identities immediately afterwards. So they have their wild phases, and then they tend to be like, obsessive workaholics or devout Catholics or like devout Muslims, because those are people who they're not reflective. So they need things which are handed to them, identities handed to them. So I've seen quite a few people who, when they're young, they really buy into this sort of wild side identity, and it means everything to them, and then they buy into some other ready-made identities straight afterwards.
100%.
Yeah. Well, you know the topic.
If you come back, I hope you do. We should talk about that, because that's something
and identity. I mean, identity is like I'm permanently obsessed with it because obviously like I've clearly had issues with it, and I don't understand. I find the whole thing for myself, my identity, very difficult to understand. And it's interesting to see how it has become over the past few years, literally the central political question in the world today. It's tearing apart continents and nations, the question of identity.
It is. And I mentioned Jordan Peterson. He's sort of taken the internet through, with a wave.
Is he like an alt-right person?
It comes across as that,
yeah.
And some views seem like that. But again, I like to have an open mind with both sides of the whatever the debate. But essentially, yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, yeah. But it's very interesting seeing, because it's a new type of alt-right. It's an alt.
Yeah. Well, the alt-right now is old.
Yeah.
So I guess.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to look into. But yeah, this quote again. It's what I found quite interesting is that connection you make with identity in objects. And it comes back to that whole caveman thing. I think this is part of.
But it's the same thing. It's like the idea of we instinctively externalize our mythologies, our
I should have made the
values.
Of course, yeah.
It's what we do, and objects as vessels can contain values from any particular one moment in time. The way I like describing objects is they're a little bit like if we are as individuals, as communities, we are really complex series of flux and changes through time. But that's sort of a multi-dimensional thing. But if you slice that at any one given moment in time, you can freeze it and you can turn it into something solid. And objects do that. So they are cultural artifacts which do tell stories in one given moment in time about a culture or about a person or about a period. And of course, almost immediately, like the Greeks saying that time is like water flowing. No, you can never stop it. It's constantly changing, and we are the same. We're constantly changing. But nonetheless, at any one given moment in time, you can create artifacts as a culture and as a people. And architecture does this. That does nonetheless embody many, many things about you, or about the culture in general. Like I don't know if it's a big building or if it's like a pot. And so I really believe in the magic of objects in that respect. Have you ever done the thing like the 100 objects at the British Museum, the world history in 100 objects? It's quite nice. It does that. So it's sort of like telling world history through 100 objects, and you go around the British Museum really cool. And you sort of read the stories that unravel through. No, it's literally a thing. It's like a book that tells a story of 100 objects that are permanently there. You just go around the museum looking at them, but they sort of unravel incredible ranges of historical material from just like a little silver pot.
Wow. You say it's at the British Museum?
Yeah, it's a book, and it's a Radio 4 podcast as well. But it's I guess I've always instinctively felt this, and I guess sort of falling in love with ceramics was something that really helped me clarify intellectually, and also be able to sort of verbally explain the magic of objects, because I sort of by mistake became obsessed with ceramics. I was a hoarder when I was a bit younger. Like I couldn't instinctively hoard things. So I wanted to give it a structure. So I said, okay, I'm going to collect something rather than hoarding. And I couldn't afford paintings, and I couldn't afford, I don't know, anything, to be honest. And then, but ceramics turned out to be really cheap, really affordable. And so I started collecting ceramics. And what's amazing is it opened up this whole magic world. I mean, talk about a Pandora's box, where it's baked earth. I mean, it goes back as far as humanity goes back. Like people molded earth and put it in the sun and started making vessels. It's a very, very ancient craft, and pretty much every culture has ceramics. And ceramics are both architectural materials as bricks, as terracotta tiles, but they're also always vessels that relate to rituals, values. Okay, because a lot of them were just symbolic, but also everyday use and function, and social relations. And all of these things, as well as, because they have shape and they have decoration, okay, because people layer them, they put glazing, they immediately start absorbing artistic tendencies and practices and ornamental tendencies and practices from a given period in a particular place in time, as well as the functional, more anthropological and symbolic side of a culture. So ceramics are amazing. You can literally travel the world studying a culture through the smallest, most modest of objects, seemingly. Yeah. But they're not. They're have you ever seen Stargate? No. Stargate is this like cheesy cheesy sort of sci-fi show where there's like a ring and you step through and you step into another planet. But they're like stargates. Or synecdoches. Synecdoches are the phrase that means, like, it's a one word that represents much bigger things.
Right.
And so reading specific histories and also I went through university. I was an antique dealer when I was at university.
Standard.
This evolved out of the passion for ceramics. It sort of turned into a business.
Wow.
And that part of that was researching and reading, and it led me down lots of rabbit holes of German porcelain in the sort of mid 18th century, Italian porcelain in the sort of mid 20th century, and reading up about sort of very specific stories that effectively illuminate that point that I just made, but in very concrete ways that help me then extrapolate how can I reverse that. So how can I that's historical analysis of particular objects from, let's say, Dresden in 1745 in relation to Augustus the Great and his relationship with the Medici, for instance, and how can I reverse engineer and say I am going to invent my own stories in relation to the world now and turn those into objects. So how can I instrumentalize that tendency in my live practice? And this just came like randomly, through like having fallen in love with ceramics incidentally, and then I needed money, so I started selling them, and then I started to research specifically because I wanted to know which ones to buy, which ones were good, and then started reading amazing historical books about specific stories that then opened up a lot of really interesting realms of design investigation.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of being revealed to me right now that it is if you like the soul, or it's like the fundamental kind of metaphor of architecture itself. Ceramics, like you described, it's a form, you decorate it, and it's got deep anthropological roots, social roots.
Yeah,
tells a story. I think of buildings as essentially they're just they're
big ceramics,
giant scale. Yeah. Well, technically they are essentially.
No, but I mean. And theoretically, in terms of what we were discussing.
Even theoretically, I didn't make that theoretical.
But they survive a lot less. Buildings actually, it's interesting because architects are always going on about timelessness, but buildings tend to last a lot less than vessels like that. Because another thing about ceramics is seriality. So the modernism supposedly ruined the aura of the original. It's just rubbish. The fear of copies on Instagram is just ridiculous. It's like it's fundamental to the way we operate is the desire for reproduction. I mean, the image of the Buddha, how many of those that are exactly the same? There's literally hundreds of millions of them around Southeast Asia. That doesn't, that didn't arrive with Instagram. This is ancient. Anyway, seriality was important to ceramics. So there was always repetition involved. And that meant that these things tend to survive much more. So even when a lot of them are destroyed...
Naturally, you mean? Like naturally they were just repetition? Or
No, just by the nature of making of ceramics. People tended to not make one thing at one time. Yeah. You would make a set of plates. Right. You would make a series of vases. So there was... and then when casting came into it, you could produce hundreds of them. But just naturally, it tended to be a material which led to seriality. Bricks are cereal, tiles are cereal, pots are cereal, plates are cereal. Not cereal you eat.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Enumerated. And that just meant that they survive more. They're small, they're transferable, and they're numerous. So they tend to survive more than buildings, which collapse from earthquakes, political changes. They get modified because you build a building and no matter how...
We've got prefab now.
What do you
mean? Not now. Prefab essentially serial, right? Prefab architecture.
I mean, and architecture is serial when we talk about mass producing housing, for instance.
Yeah, but we hate that.
Well, I do.
I don't know. Do I?
So for instance, it's highly unlikely that every single Georgian building will be destroyed. Georgian townhouse, there will be some of those surviving. So in that respect, you're right. But let's say big architectural structures, from the past 5,000 years.
Not Bjarke Ingels.
No, it's
okay.
big, large. From the past 5,000 years, it's less likely that a major building from a city that's been lost has survived than pots. A lot more pots tend to have survived. But anyway, this is just in terms of like the funny fact that like the small, humble things survive a lot longer very often than the big, Ozymandias monuments, which tend to crumble. I like that
we've talked about this though, because it makes the connection between your architectural background, which is I think the crux of what this episode was supposed to be about. And I'm glad we got there, because it's always just chance with these things anyway. But what was that connection between what you do now and your architectural background? And it's a deep connection. In fact, it is the fundamental connection that I see. And it makes me think about buildings. I'm actually I remembered the idea of the palimpsest, the building which kind of
layered.
Yeah, the layers of history are embedded within it in a sort of artifactal way. And there's all these notions of ceramics and everything you just mentioned as well. I think I'm going to be a bit more eyes on with ceramics now when I'm traveling around. But sort of we're coming to the end of it now. But with that identity thing, there was this one clip where I don't know whether you'd filmed it or I think it was a film that you'd referenced. It might have been your film. You made a film, right?
I've made quite a few.
There was someone
not
who,
proper films, videos.
Yeah, but there was someone who died, an elderly man who died, and either you or the film showed that his possessions.
Yes, I mean, so that's a reference that I use quite a lot. Is if you walk into the living room of someone that you don't know well, who's recently passed away, it's always no matter what, it's always quite a powerful experience. Because, like I said, people externalize themselves. No matter what they do, it's instinctive, and their personality comes across as an atmosphere, very potent.
So potent, happens. Man. Like I've never been there. I mean, I've been there. I mean, when my grandma died, and we went into her room.
So you've experienced it.
I have. But you knew her. Mention it. I didn't cry when I saw her body.
But then you see that.
I did not cry when I was sat there in front of her body. It felt less real to me. But then I go and sit down in a room, and I started looking at the bench.
Sorry, it's a very powerful and.
I was looking at her bench. I was looking at her doors, and thought she would open the doors, and the creaks would happen, and she'd pull out a little sweet, and then the floodgates opened. And that's so beautiful, and that's why I've got it here, because it is an incredible. It's an incredible concept to think about, and now to take it to a more.
But just to say that's a sort of another example of the difference between architecture and building. It's another sort of metaphor that I sometimes use is the difference between the morgue and the cemetery. So the morgue is like the body. Yeah, it's white, it's clinical, it's about the facts. It's the matter of fact, it's the weight. It's statistics. It's just the body. Okay? But we're not our bodies. We are more like the cemetery, which is the symbolic place. It's where people put a stone and a photograph that somehow embodies them. They write a phrase that reminds them of them. They put objects. It depends on the culture, but they put objects that remind them of them. They write letters. We're not our bodies. We are our dreams, our imagination. We're about stories, beauty, passion, anger, confusion. All of those things that are symbolic. And it's a bit like, for me, building is the body and architecture is all of that. And it's a little bit like the room before your grandmother moved into it, okay, when it was empty. That's building. Architecture is how it was left.
Wow. That is profound, yeah.
Well, no, but it's the same with cities. Imagine a city without architects that was forcibly, as a horrible experiment, forced somehow to be created by builders who hated everything that wasn't just so super flat and super functional and straight. Even when people build for themselves, huts. It's wonderful when you see people sort of doing their own architecture, because they go wild. They elaborate it and they sort of ornament it, and they make strange things because it's instinctive.
Yeah.
But imagine a city that was made on purpose without any of that.
Someone's got to do a project about that.
I think the closest that society's ever come maybe is some of the sort of Soviet city making projects like Magnitogorsk or something, where they purposefully were literally trying to cut out any of that. But it would be horrendous. It'd be like being stuck in a morgue.
The Hunger Games map comes to mind.
The Hunger Games map.
Not the map. The old imperial. It's a very brutalistic setting. Maybe.
Well, no, but brutalism's styled, so it wouldn't. It would just be like flat and white.
What? The buildings?
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't even need that.
No 2, 3, 5, 6, 10 stories.
Yeah, but like blank.
Yeah.
And
someone's got to do a project on it. If anyone's out there at uni, do that. Would you?
Denatured architecture. Scary.
You got a title now as well. But no, back to that thing. I wanted to give an example of walking into a deceased person's room and something which came to mind was the Friends episode when Mr. Heckles dies, and
the guy downstairs. Yeah.
And Chandler walks in, and it's so Mr. Heckles dies, and Chandler's going through his things, terrified in how similar they both were.
Oh, I remember that.
And ends up being a really life-changing experience for all the characters. That's what I love about Friends is they can do the comedy incredibly well, and then they can do the drama, incredibly well. The Friends is
that the one where they have a sort of communal? They remember him at the end of the episode. Oh, it's really sweet.
But you know what it was? They walked in, they hated this guy. Yeah, he's just an annoying guy. But when he went through his thing and he grabbed his broom, and what he did is he heard them knock, and and he gets this broom. He's like, cut the noise, and he's like, oh, and that broomstick, that was the object. Yeah. And what did it do to him? It caused the most profound experience and connection you could make through the broomstick. So that came to my mind.
Friends and Simpsons, all human knowledge is embedded somewhere in an episode of The Simpsons or in an episode of Friends.
So there's your precedents.
I used to, when I was growing up, in my early adulthood, I would explain everything through Simpsons examples. But I've actually forgotten most of it now, which is a bit sad.
You seen Rick and Morty?
No, what is it?
Oh, you gotta watch that. That's
the cartoon.
Yeah, okay. It's a new one. It's very unique. The guy actually gets drunk when he does his parts.
Okay. Rick and Morty.
It's a weird take on Back to the Future with Marty and the professor guy.
Oh, okay, fine.
I highly recommend.
God, I remember when those first came out.
Yeah, this is really good animation. Anyway, there is more, but I don't think we have time. We're already an hour 24 in. But yeah, I hope you come back. I'm really appreciative for you coming in the first place. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the tea and the apple juice.
No, that's my pleasure. I'm glad we got to where we got, because it's nice to have a conclusion or realization, at least for myself. I think one of the biggest parts.
You are the guy downstairs.
What do you mean?
That's the realization.
Oh shit. No, one of the main reasons I wanted to do this was so I can learn more, and I get to learn from people like you. So that's thanks, man.
No, thank you. Cheers.
Nice one. That's a wrap.